is our fourth meeting on phenomenology. We had discussed ontology, ethics and morality, and APC by Professor H. Peter Steeves, Professor Hard, and Professor Mayer from DePaul, Chicago. This is our fourth, I think, yeah, fourth meeting, and Zahra is just leading the meeting as a moderator, and Lillian will just present what she thinks about phenomenology and psychology. Please share and keep your cameras off and your mics. After the presentation, you can just ask your questions in Farsi or English. You can ask them by your own words or type them in the public chat so we can translate them or read them to the presenter. That's it. Zahra, thank you.
Thank you. So I will begin with a short introduction, Lillian, and then the floor will be yours. For those who know Husserl and his philosophy, his obsession with the clarification of the fundamental distinction between transcendental philosophy and psychology is an obvious case. Husserl repeatedly insists that modern psychology, like all of so-called positive sciences, couldn't truly reach out the fundamental problem with their a priori assumptions about the objectivity of the world that are actually rooted in our natural attitude towards the life world, namely how we experience the world as a whole and the things and beings in it as objects of our intentional consciousness, unless by means of a change of the natural attitude into the transcendental attitude. It is open to a Copernican conversion, wherewith it assumes the new sense of a completely radical transcendental consideration of the world and impresses this sense on all phenomenological psychological analysis. In this way, intentional psychology can, prior to other positive sciences, go beyond the naivism and become a discipline in line with the transcendental philosophy. This primacy came from the fact that, according to Husserl, intentional psychology already has the transcendental hiddenly within itself, and only a final clarification of its sense is needed in order to make the Copernican shift, which does not change the content of psychology's intentional result, but only leads back to its ultimate sense. In other words, in order to gain its full meaning as a subjective study of an objective phenomenon means the psyche, psychology must return to its fundamental intuitive and self-evident grounds of both objective and intersubjective sides. In Iran, there are many scholars doubtfully ask about what exactly the transcendental phenomenology is and how it can be attainable as an approach in different disciplines. During our previous online meetings, and hopefully by publishing the first Iranian yearbook of phenomenology in the near future, we at ISP are trying to give an insight about this philosophy and how numerous scholars around the world use this approach in their methodological research in the field of political and social science. Today, our guest and presenter will draw on a way of applying a phenomenological approach in psychological studies, particularly by focusing on the experiencing of psychological trauma, a methodology mostly based on Husserl's student Gerda Walter, alternative account of communal experience, and her notion of habitual unification. Finally, she will examine gathered data of real testimonies from trauma survivors based on this new adaptive phenomenological approach. Lillian Wilde is currently working on her PhD dissertation about the phenomenology of intersubjectivity trauma under the supervision of Professor Matthew Ratcliffe and Professor Christina Vanderfeld Cornelis at the Department of Philosophy of the University of York, UK. Also, she has written her master thesis with the title of The Fragility of Me, a phenomenological account of selfhood and trauma with Professor Dan Zahavi at the Copenhagen University. If you are interested in the subject, you can find her recent articles about the subject of trauma and phenomenology online, such as Trauma, Phenomenological Causality and Implication. Lillian, we are all ears. You can take it right now.
Thank you so much, Zahra.
You're welcome.
And thank you, Mahmoud, for inviting me. It's really, really lovely to meet you and to meet fellow phenomenologists from so far away. I'm usually using Zoom for online meetings, so I've not used Skype in probably 3 years. I will see if I can share my presentation with you. Can you see the first slide now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so now you should be able to see only the first slide, right? No, none of my notes, I hope.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So Sarah already introduced me, so thank you for that. I'm currently in my 3rd year of my PhD, so I'm kind of starting the writing up. And this is part of the PhD. It's going to be 1 chapter towards the end. And it's based on a study I conducted last year online, an online survey. So I'm going to draw on testimonies that I received from trauma survivors, and these might be hard to hear for some, and if you just need to kind of zone out and leave your screen for a moment, that's absolutely fine. So just make sure that you take care of yourself. That just as a brief disclaimer. So today I'm going to talk to you about psychological trauma and the phenomenology of not feeling understood. So I'm going to begin with a brief overview of my methodology and the intersection between phenomenology and qualitative research. I'm then going to talk about the feeling of being understood and whether or not it is a cognitive achievement, which I don't think it is. I will then draw on accounts of we-intentionality. So it's a quite recent debate, which promises but ultimately falls short in explaining these background feelings. And then I will draw on Gerda Walter, the phenomenologist who was a student of Edmund Husserl, and she wrote her thesis in 1923 under Husserl's supervision. And it's received like increased attention in the last decade in contemporary phenomenology. And so I'm going to look at her account of unification and of humans who also, which I will explain later, and apply this to the statements of the trauma survivors. And by this, I hope to be able to shed some light on these background feelings of belonging, which I think constitute feelings of being understood. So to begin, I hope I'm not going to disappoint you too much, but I am not a transcendental phenomenologist. I'm applying phenomenology to psychopathologies. And Dan Zahavi has written a few papers in the last years on this topic, on the scope of phenomenology and how it can be applied beyond the transcendental phenomenology. And in one of his papers, he writes that qualitative researchers should strive to let their own research be informed by central phenomenological concepts such as life world, intentionality, empathy, pre-reflective experience, horizon, historicity, and the lived body. They do not necessarily have to go through the epoche and apply the reduction in order to use phenomenology in their methodology. And there are several research groups at the moment who are working in a very similar fashion. So, for example, there is the group headed by Dan Zahavi with Anthony Fernandez. You have the pictures on the side. In Oxford, at the University of Oxford, entitled Phenomenology and Nursing, in which Zahavi and Fernandez work together with qualitative researchers as well as nurses and professionals in psychiatry to work in a mutually informative way. There is also the newly established grief group at the University of York, headed by Matthew Ratcliffe, who's my supervisor, as Sarah mentioned, and Louise Richardson. And there are currently 2 postdocs working on the project. And they've already published a few things also relating to COVID, so they're really contemporary in their approach. And then there's also the Center for Phänomenologische Psychopathologie in Heidelberg, headed by Thomas Fuchs. And also he works together with psychiatrists and has been so for, I think, the last 10 years already. So this just as a brief introduction to the current phenomenological research that happens beyond just philosophy and happens interdisciplinarily. If you're interested in research that is happening there, I'm happy to share some articles as well towards the end. You're welcome to contact me about that. So now to my methodology. I'm working in a quite similar way to these 3 centers. So as Sarah said, I did my master's in Copenhagen, where I wrote my thesis under Dan Zahavi's supervision. So I was working with phenomenology, and I'm drawing on the phenomenological literature, such as Husserl, and also Gerda Walter, his student. And last year I conducted an online survey. So I wanted to listen to trauma survivors and hear their experience firsthand. And so you can see 3 example questions on the slide. The survey was open between April and September last year. And I'm happy to say that I reached my goal of 50 responses. I got 64 complete responses, and they were all very detailed and very brave. So I'm very grateful for everyone who participated in this survey. And the questions were phenomenologically inspired, and so this is what Martini and Höfting call phenomenological front-loading, in case you've heard that phrase. It's using phenomenological concepts in order to create the questions that you then use in a qualitative survey. And this is what I did as well. And in this way, I asked participants about their experience of being in the world, their experience of themselves, their embodiment, and questions about intersubjectivity, the way they experience themselves in relation to others. And one trend that became clear through the responses, one concept that came up again and again was this feeling of not being understood. And this caught my interest, so I decided to think more about this and to go back into the phenomenological literature to see if I can find anything about this feeling of being understood. So here are 2 quotes from the survey. with the death of my son, it's hard to explain the horrific flashbacks I get from seeing him. From the abuse, it's hard to explain the terror the younger me feels when I come in contact with men from that country. Another person reported, I tried to explain it to close friends, but they were not able to comprehend it. So one way of making sense of feeling understood is taking it to be some form of cognitive achievement. So the individual feels understood when the other can grasp the meaning of what they're saying, whether it's in words or in gestures. And they can understand the reasons one gives for feeling the way one does. Conversely, this means that the individual is overcome by a sense of alienation when the other cannot understand the reasons they give for feeling the way they're feeling. So it might appear to the affected individual that there simply are no reasons for experiencing either the traumatizing event or the distress that comes from it. And therefore, it is impossible to make the other one understand them. So it is a cognitive failure. I do not think that this is the most prevalent way in which people experience this feeling of not being understood. I have another slide with further testimonies. And here it appears that the feeling at stake goes deeper than just an unsuccessful exchange of propositions. So we have statements like, I feel excluded, not one of us. It caused me to feel separate, that I was not the same as other people because we didn't have the same experience. I feel very alone and different to others much of the time. Always a feeling of being a stranger to other people. Or I don't think it's possible for anyone to completely understand my experience. I also feel a bit like a stranger. And these frequent references to feeling separate, not the same, a stranger or alienated and excluded, suggests that what's at stake here is a sense of belonging. It's a background feeling that is woven through the individual's everyday experience of being in a shared world. So a simple misunderstanding or failure to convey the reasons for feeling the way I do may be painful, and it may result in feelings of loneliness or abandonment, but alienation appears to be a sense that goes deeper than that. It's a feeling that the individual is not necessarily reflectively aware of, but that constantly lingers in the background and colors the individual's experience without necessarily becoming focal. So what is this sense of belonging that is constitutive of feelings of being understood? I turned to the literature of we intentionality to look for answers. And there are some really interesting articles that have been published in the last decade. One of them, for example, is by Pachery, entitled How Does It Feel to Act Together?, which was published in Phenomenology and Cognitive Sciences. And she draws on ideas of joint action to explain feelings of togetherness. She says, engagement in joint action may involve a transformation of agentive identity and a partial or complete shift from a sense of self-agency to a sense of we-agency. And the more accurate other predictions are, and the less distinguishable self-predictions are from other predictions, the greater that shift towards a sense of we-agency. However, this does not quite get at what I'm interested in, because the emphasis here, as in many of these texts in the we intentionality, is on joint action rather than feeling. And the paper addresses this question of the experience of togetherness only in light of joint action. Also, she has this concept of pure we agency, which she describes as feeling one, which, for example, happens in dancing or in military drills, where we seem to fuse with the other. So our self and other predictions fuse so much that it's almost as if we are one. But the examples that she uses are so specific that it makes me think that what she's after is not the same as what I am after, because I'm after something more spread out, a background sense that is more pervasive than that. Salmela and Nagatsu are two phenomenologists who responded to her paper with a very similarly entitled paper called How Does It Really Feel to Act Together? But ultimately, their conclusion, simply put, it feels good, again, disappoints. They also do not take into account background feelings of belonging. Hans Bernhard Schmidt has published several papers on, excuse me, there they are, on plural subjectivity. So in 2014, he published these two papers about plural self-awareness and the feeling of being a group, in which he draws a parallel case between singular pre-reflective self-awareness and its plural form. So he engages more with a pre-reflective sense of belonging and of togetherness. And he says that just as the individual is self-aware, so is the plural subject. It's not something achieved by subjects involved through some form of agreement or declaration, but because it's like something for us to have a certain experience, there is a plural subject to which the experience is given. In his words, the idea is that the basic form of plural subjecthood does not originate in a, however, implicit form of agreement, but rather in a sort of mental integration in which the participants are aware of some of their attitudes as theirs collectively. In the same way, the individual self is not constituted by an act of self-reflection that presupposes another self that does the reflecting, but is self-awareness. People need not be a group in order to form another group. They need only be aware of some of their attitudes as theirs collectively. So it seems we're getting closer into the realm of an implicit sense of togetherness, a more background sense of it. However, he still restricts himself to actual we experiences. So specific attitudes, specific experiences are given as ours, and not a more pervasive, an implicit sense. So to sum up, neither acting together nor having an emotion together account for the feeling of belonging, which I'm after here. And what's still missing is an account of background feelings of belonging. So this is where I will turn to Gerda Walter. And as you can see on the slide, her thesis has not yet been translated. It's in German, and it's still in the old German typeset, so it's quite hard to read. But I hope that fairly soon someone will put in the work and translate this work, because it is really very interesting. And in it, she introduces this idea of unification, which she calls Einigung, and which is both affective and habitual. And she introduces it as part of her explanation of how communities are established. which in turn requires we experiences between individuals. So I will begin by explaining her explanation of we experiences. And she says there are 4 requirements. And we have an image of Javier Bardem here as an example case. So in order to have a we experience, so to properly share an experience, Wilde says, we need, first of all, common intentionality. We need to share an intentional object. And that can be, for example, a movie. But this, of course, is not enough. It's not enough that both of us log into Netflix at the same time to watch Beautiful. This is the name of this movie that I took the screenshot from. We also need reciprocal awareness of the other one having the same experience. And this needs to go both ways. So it's not enough that I'm aware that you're also watching the movie, but you also need to be aware that I'm also watching the movie. Furthermore, there needs to be some kind of intertwinement or interdependency of our experiences. So my experience might be enriched by knowing that you are also watching this movie at the same time, and that you adore Javier Bardem, and so I come to appreciate his acting even more because I know you're a fan. But still at this point, Gerda Walter says this is still not a proper we experience. What is missing is unification. And that is the feeling of feeling oneself to be part of a we. So it's an affective dimension. It's a feeling that the individual is almost overcome by. And this affective dimension is what I would like to explore more. So this is where Walter's text gets a bit tricky, because she draws on a lot of metaphors of warm waves of light and energy and light bulbs. So I'm not going to go into that. I think what is essential here and what she's trying to convey is that there is a feeling which connects two individuals in a very specific way. And she writes that in unification, the subject intentionally absorbs the others in their own self. So what does this mean? She means by this that my singular experience becomes changed and colored by taking you into my perspective. And so my perspective changes and it becomes ours. Importantly, her account retains the plurality of the subjects. The we does not replace the I, but the experience of us takes place in me, in Salice and Uemura's words. And this is essential for accounts of sharing, because proper sharing can only happen when there are two subjects who are sharing an experience. When we fuse the subject and we have only one subject, there's no proper sharing possible. And this integration of the other's perspective into my own can become sedimented over time. So it's no longer necessary for it to be actualized. We don't have to be actually watching a movie together and be mutually aware and influencing each other's experience of it. Over time, we build the habit of being unified. So even without being in the same room, without thinking of one another, this sense of unification remains in the background of my experience. And here she uses an image of a musical organ. They're very common in Europe. I don't know if you have them in Iran, but in many churches there are like these really big organs, and the way they're played is that there's a background note that runs through the piece. And so Wilde says that in a similar way, there's a background note and it resonates. And we use these metaphors even in everyday language. We say, oh, something resonated with me. It struck a note. And so in this way, she says that whenever I think of you, the note resonates a little in the background. So we have here a lovely account of this background sense. And she draws on Husserl's account of sedimentation and habit to explain this. So what we now have is both the affective component, so the feeling, as well as the background component, the habit. And the way she describes this is that here, even if only in a vague awareness in the background, and absolutely not in attentive knowledge or presentation, other humans who also are always given in a more or less clear and noticed co-presence. So what are these humans who also? What is this? What is it like to unify with others in this vague and implicit but steady way? She writes, this also can be determined in various ways, depending on the kind and intentional foundation of the unification, as humans who also value, also have such goals, also feel, desire, think, etc., in the same way as the subject in question. It can also refer to the Grundhaltung, the basic attitude towards the whole of life, the whole cosmos. So experiential typicalities, shared affective norms, typical appraisal patterns, rules of emotional expressions, all of these are patterns that can establish a foundation for experiencing the other as similar in a significant way. So I think there are three ways in which we can understand this relation between unification and experiencing others as humans who also. The first is to say that unification is foundational for experiencing others as humans who also. So we unify, it becomes habituated and sedimented, and then or therefore we have other humans as humans who also resonating in the background of our experience. We can also understand her as saying that experiencing others as similar in a significant way is foundational for unification. We need to experience others in this way in order to unify with them in the first place. And the third option would be it's both. So unification and experiencing others as humans who also are equiprimordial. They are two sides of the same coin and are mutually implied in one another. And I think this is the most accurate interpretation of her writing, because in some sections she seems to suggest one and in others the other. So how can we apply this to the study of trauma? We have said that unified with another individual, the world feels different. The subject sees the world in light of we. And we've also said that the way the environment appears integrates the other. So through the habit, our social world changes. Our world becomes a social world in the first place. And this I argue, is impacted through trauma. We see this, for example, in Judith Herman, who is one of the most renowned trauma scholars. She published a work in 1992, so almost 30 years ago now, in which she writes, traumatized people feel utterly abandoned, utterly alone, cast out of the human and divine systems of care and protection that sustain life. Thereafter, a sense of alienation, of disconnection pervades every relationship, from the most intimate familiar bonds to the most abstract affiliations of community and religion. Susan Bryson, who is a philosopher who writes about trauma, one of the very few, she writes, I had ventured outside the human community, landed beyond the moral universe, beyond the realm of predictable events and comprehensible actions, and I didn't know how to get back. And also in the trauma testimonies that responded to my survey, if you remember from earlier on, I will show the slide again, we see that the individuals seem to struggle to experience others as humans who also share similar feelings about the world, values, experiences. And so their ability to unify is diminished or even shattered. And therefore they feel like they're no longer belonging. So to sum up, feelings of not being understood, I have said, can be conceptualized as an absence of a feeling of belonging. This is not to say that some feelings of not being understood are not a failure of a cognitive achievement. But I think that what is at stake in trauma is those that go deeper, those that are linked to the sense of belonging. Unification, that is the affective habitual sense of belonging, constitutes feelings of belonging. And unification goes hand in hand with experiencing others as humans who are similar in a significant way. Thus, the feelings of being a stranger, of feeling excluded and alienated, reported by trauma survivors, can be explained in terms of a disruption of unification or of experiencing others as humans who also. Now, where does this leave us? Another theme that came up in the survey was that many found solace in community after their trauma. For example, someone reported, I am not the same person I was before. My behavior and comprehension of the world is different than it used to be, and most people are oblivious. However, I have found my spiritual community, including my new friends. Many of those people have been through traumatic events, and they accept me and are more understanding on all levels. Someone else says, to some degree, calling myself an assault victim and engaging in feminist theory around this offered me a sense of belonging. And another, some who have had a similar experience understand, but most just pay lip service. So what we see here is that a variety of the testimonies point at how they manage to cope with the feeling of not belonging by finding groups of interest, by finding similarities and connecting with people who share a similar world of the view. And in this way, re-establishing feelings of belonging and through it, feelings of being understood. So with all of this, I hope that I could show how phenomenology and trauma studies in specific, or phenomenology and psychopathological studies in general, can go hand in hand and be mutually informative. So thank you so much for your attention. And if you'd like to get in touch after this, here's my email address. You're welcome to note it down.
Thank you, Lillian. I'm going to say something in فارسی. دوستان اگر سوالی دارین میتونین تو بخش کامنت ها بنویسین که پاسخگو باشن.
I have just some questions about intentionality in the term you used in your presentation. First is how intentionality can be supposed as something belonging to me or he or she, but still remain a Husserlian term. This is my first question.
Sorry, your audio was a bit
Okay.
off. Could you repeat that?
I just asked this: how can you talk of intentionality as my intentionality, your intentionality, her or his intentionality, and use it in an Husserlian term? Because I think in an Husserlian term, there is not my, your, his, or her intentionality. It is intentionality.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Yeah, I think this is exactly the point where transcendental phenomenology differs from phenomenological methodology in general, right? So in the transcendental tradition, as I understand it, we go beyond the individual. We go whereas in phenomenology, that does not apply the epoche. We stay in the individualized experience. And so we have perspectival ownership, for example. I forgot her name now, but I can look it up. There's a researcher who in the past wrote about personal ownership and perspectival ownership of experience, which might explain this. Sorry, I think you are muted.
Hamid, you are muted.
Okay, you can hear me now.
Yes.
Yeah, let me make my point more clear by just the second question.
Yeah.
I mean, is intentionality a way of relating to the world?
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about it, or it is just a term to call the content of this relating to the world? I think this is the problem I have, not the.
Yeah.
I mean, when you say intentionality, my intentionality, his intentionality, her intentionality, you are talking about the content of my, yours, or hers. I mean, intentionality. I
Yes.
believe that intentionality has an ontological character,
Mm-hmm.
in by which your account doesn't regard it, or point to.
Yeah, I think I understand what you mean. So yes, it is the way of relating to the world, the subject's way of relating to the world.
So my third question and last, regarding what we talked about intentionality, is we experience, as I've read in Dan Zahavi, because you may not know, we are translating one of his papers in our yearbooks called We Experience.
Mm-hmm.
Regarding that account of intentionality, is we experience regarding intentionality the content of our experiences or something else?
Is it we content?
Yeah,
Is that the question?
Yeah, we experience is about the content of the intentional experience or something else.
Mm. Is this the you, me, we paper? Is that the paper that you're translating?
I don't remember the exact name
Do
because
you know what the title
it's
is?
yeah, it's we experience something,
Then
and
it's
it's
a
an
different
old
one.
yeah. Let me just search it. I will just let tell you the name.
Okay.
I'll search it. It is we experience something. We experience that's that. But would you please just talk about what I asked about the you, me, and we, the sharing emotional experience? It's published January 2016. Yeah,
Okay, yeah, this is not one of the ones I have read.
yeah.
Um,
But
so I think
forget the paper. The
okay.
question is this. The question is this. When you talk about we experience, are you talking about we content? I mean, we, the content of experience, or something else?
Something else. So the we experience is that it's a shared experience. It's the type of experience.
Yeah. I
So
mean, when you
the
say
we is
share,
not the object of experience, but the we is the subject of experience.
so we experience is about the subject of the subject pool of the experience. Thank you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there is this difficulty with retaining plurality.
Uh-huh.
So there is still a you and a me who share the experience, which
So
makes it given to us as ours.
so when you say we share an experience, you're saying that we share a way of subjective relating to the object of experience, huh?
Yeah.
Thank you. So what how you explain trauma regarding these three experience in a traumatic lose of someone who was involved in the we I involved I felt myself in I what do I lose? What is traumatic in losing him or her? Is it just this subjective pool, or it's an account of the reality? What makes trauma?
Um, I think so. It's not a necessary constituent of a traumatic experience. It's just a very common occurrence after trauma that the individual doesn't feel connected in a meaningful way. So this doesn't mean that a traumatized individual can't watch a movie together with someone or go out for an ice cream with someone. So there are still these actual experiences which are shared by two individuals that are mutually aware of one another. But the feeling of unification, this fourth requirement that I mentioned in Walter, I think that is where a lot of trauma survivors struggle to establish a meaningful connection, to establish this feeling of belonging together.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Thank you. I see one question in the chat.
Hello.
ببخشید.
Hello, Lillian. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was clarifying, and we really thankful to have you here with us today. I have two questions, if I may ask. By the way, I'm Mahmoud Reza. And hi. Can we say that our sense of objectivity, both in natural attitude and in objective sciences, For example, the sense of as an objective goal, an objective value, etc., came from this sense of belonging and implicit experiencing others as humans who also. And another question, if I may ask you, it's how trauma experiences, I mean the experience of a psychological trauma affects the feeling of belonging. Can you know, I didn't quite catch the relation. Can you elaborate more on this? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Mahmoud. Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
So yeah, the idea is that sorry, the Skype is acting up. So the idea is that in trauma, like using Walter's framework now, so we say that unification is this final requirement for proper sharing and for feelings of togetherness. And she uses this framework to explain how communities are established. So it is almost like a glue that gets people together on an experiential level. So the others' experience colors my experience because I'm unified with them. I quite like the example of watching a movie that you know the one you're watching it with really hates. Like they hate the actor, they hate science fiction or whatever, and it makes you enjoy the movie significantly less. I'm sure that everyone has been in the situation where you're like, you really want to enjoy something, but you know that the person you're together with, that you're unified with, doesn't enjoy it. So your experience is altered by the sense of unification. And this unification goes hand in hand with experiencing the other as similar in a significant way. And so I think this is where the trauma comes in. And the traumatized individual experiences something that is so beyond what we perceive as possible to happen in the world, or that as possible to happen to us. It changes the basic attitude of the individual who goes through that experience. It changes what they value, and it changes how they experience it. It really changes like their complete being in the world. And so now the experience of the traumatized individual on this very basic level is so different to that from other people that they were formerly able to connect with, that now this unification can no longer happen. Yeah, because the unification goes hand in hand with experiencing the other as similar in a significant way. Does that clarify it more?
Well, yeah, thank you. You know, I think that there's something that all of us feel, okay, the normal life should, you know, just occur in this way, and we don't expect something bad happens to us, you know. We know that something bad maybe happen to someone else, you know, someone new or not new closely, but after something happened to us, we just, you know, experience something new that we didn't expect before, and that changed everything. And you know, many others didn't have that experience too, so they didn't understand us. They can't understand us very well. So this change in the sense of belonging happens. Can we say something like that?
Yeah, you can say it like that. And I think this is what also differentiates severely distressing experiences from traumatizing experience. Because we can go through something really hard and difficult and still be able to integrate it into our shared way of understanding the world and life. But when we fail to establish this intersubjective meaning, that's where it becomes traumatic, because it becomes incommunicable. So I think in the end, trauma is almost a failure of an intersubjectively established meaning.
Thank you very much.
So one of the participants asked the question in the comment section, what would be the problem if we replace every word phenomenology with a new one, namely psychology in your talk? Would it change something? Because psychology speaks about, I believe, the experiences, embodiment, psyche, or community feeling, etc., in the same way as you did. If we don't need epoche, then we can very well call it psychology. And I think that will be better in that case.
Okay, thank you for that question. Yes, this is what I talked about a little in my methodology. So yeah, it's the question whether phenomenology that is not transcendental is still phenomenology, and whether a methodology that uses phenomenology without being transcendental is still phenomenological, or am I just doing psychology? And I think there is some value to keeping phenomenology in the equation, and that is that the tradition of phenomenology has introduced concepts such as the life world, such as intersubjective sense-making, such as embodiment. And all of these concepts are phenomenologically born, and so they are at home within the phenomenological framework, and they can be made sense of in that way. Whereas psychology lacks this, if you want, this pool of concepts and this theoretical framework. So in short, I think we would lose something if we said psychology in that case, or we would be misnoming it. Yeah. And if you're interested in thinking more about this, the two papers that I quoted by Dan Zahavi, he writes about this and why it's still phenomenology, even if it's not transcendental.
Well, I think it's, you're doing psychology in natural attitude and not in transcendental attitude, right? Yeah, to be short.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not against what Husserl says. Actually, yeah, all of the sciences and objective sciences actually can do so, and they work in the natural attitude, not in transcendental attitude. But they should, consider the basis, the fundamental ground or the research as well.
Yeah. And it is not, just because it's not transcendental doesn't mean it can't question the presuppositions. It's just not useful in every case to bracket all presuppositions. But I think it's, especially in psychopathology, the psychopathological state itself is questioning the presuppositions. but there is no need to just bracket everything, because if we bracket everything, we can't draw the comparison between the disturbed and the non-disturbed state anymore.
Lillian, may I ask another question, please?
Yes, of course. I can't see you. There you are. Okay.
Yeah. What is your starting point in psychological analysis when you're talking about the phonological psychology? What's your starting?
What do you mean by starting point?
I mean, what is the point on which you base your account of psychology, your phonological psychology? In modern psychology, we have individual persons as the starting point. Which is your phonological starting point?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. It is. I guess it's several things, but I think it's structures of experience when you boil it down. I'm looking at various accounts of individual experience, and I look what they have in common, and I look for patterns and structures. So in a way, yeah, that is also what makes it phenomenological, is not just looking at the qualia of a person's experience, but at looking at the structures underlying these experiences in general. And at the same time, I'm also basing my research on these concepts that come from phenomenology. So I think it's these two starting points that I have. Yes.
So I'm sorry again. To make it more clear, to make it more clear for the audiences, and because I myself am interested in the case somehow, what is the difference between what you call phenomenological psychology and experimental psychology? I mean, a psychology which is focused on individual experiences, but in an empirical approach. I mean, I'm looking for the point which which lets you call it phenomenological.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I mean, I've not worked in psychiatry ever. I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't know what the methodology is. I've attended some conferences where psychologists spoke, and what struck me was that they use a lot of data, and they strip away the lived experience, if you want. So their experiments are very neutralized. They happen in a neutral space. So, for example, in order to investigate the experience of time, they conduct experiments in which they make subjects listen to beeps of various lengths. Whereas the phenomenologist would never strip away the experience of the world. The phenomenologist acknowledges the importance that embeddedness in the world has for subjective experience. I think there is just it's not one thing that differentiates phenomenology from psychology. I think it's various things, and it's little differences throughout, rather than one main difference, right?
As I remember Dan Zahavi's paper, it's about 2 years that I've just read it. I remember that Zahavi is talking about a kind of I in V, which is intervened with we. I'm just looking for this a sort of tie between the I you talk about in your narrative of psychology, and that phenomenological V, which Zahavi was talking, if you are interested in just making a relationship between your account of phenomenology and Zahavi's.
Well, I'm very biased because I studied Zahavi's work for a long time and I worked together with him. So it's I very much buy into his framework of selfhood and we intentionality. And I think when reading Zahavi, it's important to understand that he works on various levels and he keeps them quite separate. And so for a long time, he worked on an account of a minimal self, which was a very stripped version of selfhood. And what he was trying to achieve was to show that there is a minimal self of sense of selfhood that is necessarily present in each experience by definition. But he also, especially with his project, the Nursing and Phenomenology, he acknowledges that having such a minimal notion is perhaps too philosophical for certain other approaches. So depending on what your goal is in your research, you can draw on different methods within phenomenology. So you can either investigate the very pure forms of experience, like he did with the minimal self, or you can look at the self embedded in the life world, embodied and social and interactive and narrative. And it is all these things. And phenomenology doesn't ignore these things. It doesn't have to ignore these things.
That's it. Thank you.
May I ask some questions now? It is me who raised the hand. Hello.
Hi.
I'm working on it. My name is Joanne, and I'm working on a project quite related to your topic, and I have a few questions. The first question is a bit technical. Namely, I'm interested in the notion of background feelings, and I would like to know if you have found any corresponding terminologies in Husserl's work. For me, they would be something like Gemüt or the Gemütssphere or the maybe Affektivität or the affectivist relief, something like that. I'm not sure if this could be used as resources to investigate this notion of background feelings. And other suggestions would come from Heidegger, like his notion of Befindlichkeit, state of mind. I don't know how to translate it. Do you think these are suitable notions to describe what you describe as the background feelings? That's my first question.
Yeah, thank you, Joanne. I've not gone back to Husserl since I've started working on background feelings. So I've been focusing on contemporary literature and on Gerda Walter. But I think you're right that I think it's translated as mood, Gemüt. Is that possible?
Yes, I think so.
That definitely crops up in the literature, like the contemporary literature on feelings of belonging and background feelings. Sorry, not feelings of belonging. Is there something else I have?
And
oh yes, sorry. His just one more thing that I could think of is that his notion of sedimentation or habitualization explains how certain experiences come to be in the background in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. The second question is that do you have any thoughts on the question of the condition for the possibility of such understanding, an understanding which is not cognitive, as you said, but kind of affective. Is, for example, a shared experience, a shared background, a necessary condition for really understanding others in an effective way? Or are there any conditions that you think is necessary?
Yeah, I think it is an experience of that similarity. So you can have all kinds of similarities with someone. You can share the exact same basic attitudes towards life, but you need to be mutually aware of that in order for it to function as grounding for unification. And I think it's not the similarity that goes amiss in trauma, but it's the experience of it.
Yeah, so do you think that it is only someone who also had a traumatic experience who could understand another person with traumatic experience, or this is not the case?
Yeah, I'm tempted to say that everyone can feel understood by anyone else or understand someone else, because ultimately, and I guess this is like the old problem of solipsism, is that ultimately we don't have access to each other's experiential life. There will always be a perspectival difference. But nevertheless, I think that we can become aware of what we share, and it doesn't even need to be this cognitive and reflective awareness. It can be a process like empathy. It can be a direct experiencing of the other's experience. And I don't think that it's necessary for it to be the exact same experience for it to be shared and understood by another.
So this leads to my last question. You mentioned also empathy. Do you think there is any difference between empathy and what you called the kind of understanding or affective understanding?
Yeah, I guess this depends a lot on how you define empathy. And I always opt for, I'm just going with the mob of phenomenology, and I see empathy as a mode of experiencing the other's experience, so a direct experience of the other's mind, and not in the more psychological understanding of having some kind of sympathy or such. And as such, I think that is significantly different to feelings of understanding.
Okay, thank you so much.
But it really depends on how you interpret empathy.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello. I appreciate your presentation. It was very fascinating. First of all, the question that is popping up in my head is that does the shared understanding of trauma can change the meaning of the trauma for the persons who have experienced it? Is it true? Is it safe to say such thing, that the identity, meaning of it can change throughout time after they are being understood by other people?
Yeah, thank you. That is a really good question. And I think one way of approaching that, because it's not something I've thought through, but what comes to mind is the idea that the experience of one's trauma changes throughout time. Yeah, and it changes meaning. So I would think it's highly likely that having an experience of understanding will also change the experience of the trauma in retrospect.
So this is how it helps people to heal their wounds, their psychological wounds. Got it.
I would think so, yes.
Thank you very much.
At least in some cases. It's very hard to generalize when it comes to trauma, because experiences are so various. It's very difficult to say yes and no. But I definitely think that for some people it makes a lot of sense to assume that. Thank you.
All right. You're welcome. Thank you.
Mr. Safari, do you have any question for us?
Yes, a little question if you have time. Hello, thank you for your presentation. I have a little question. You know that traumas events are very different. In some cases, they are very cute, they are very fast, and they say that the brain cannot process the emotional and cognitive information of it. Can we really use the term of experience for this case, for this happening? I think it may be something other than experience, because it's over than our brain ability to manage and process the event. Can we use the term of experience for this kind of traumatic accidents? Thank you.
Thank you. I would think so. And I wouldn't know what to call it otherwise. I don't know if you have a suggestion.
You know, Lillian, this is why I just consistent clearing the meaning of psychological phenomenology or or to clearing the term phenomenology here. I think the problem with the question was with I don't know who is he. The guy is this that he misunderstand the meaning of experience. If you understand it phenomenologically, trauma can be understood as an experience. But if you don't understand it, you may say that it is something that happens suddenly. You don't have to time to, I don't know, rethink about it. I mean, you don't understand it. It is happening. How it is happens. I think what I wanted to make clear was this, that in I think that in your account of psychology, phenomenology is focused on the term experience. I mean, if we clear what we understand as a phenomenologist of experience, we can say why trauma can be called an experience. I think this is the problem with the question. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hamid.
Okay, is there any questions you may ask now, or we can just terminate the meeting?
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure. And thanks so much for your questions. It was really interesting thinking about the borders of phenomenology and placing myself in it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye. Bye-bye.